The number hit me before the implications did. 1,213, not 12. Not 100. 1,213 American cities, renamed in a single legislative act, in a single year, with almost no public debate and almost no surviving explanation for why it had to happen so fast. That year was 1871. And once you see what surrounds it, you cannot unsee it. I found this while researching something else entirely, a deep dive into 19th century municipal records for a different project about urban planning. I kept bumping into something strange. Cities with obviously Latin names. Cities with architectural nomenclature baked into their official titles, names that referenced columns, forums, capitals, porticos. Names that felt inherited rather than invented. And then, right in the middle of my research trail, this wall, a federal reorganization so sweeping it reshaped the naming conventions of the entire country, buried inside legislation that most historians treat as a boring procedural footnote. The Board of Geographic Names. Established 1890. Standardizing what had already been quietly rearranged starting in 1871. That's not administrative housekeeping. That's a nomenclature burial. Let me be fair to the official narrative, because it deserves a fair hearing before we start pulling threads. The official story goes like this: America in the mid-19th century was a naming chaos. Towns had multiple spellings. Counties shared names with other counties. The postal system was drowning in confusion. Letters sent to Springfield ended up in the wrong Springfield, of which there were, depending on the year, somewhere between 30 and 40 across different states. Surveyors disagreed with mapmakers. Mapmakers disagreed with census takers. Census takers disagreed with local tradition. And so, in the aftermath of the Civil War, with a federal government newly empowered and newly motivated to consolidate national identity, a rationalization project began. Rename the duplicates. Standardize the spellings. Build a coherent national geographic vocabulary. That's reasonable. That's even admirable, in a purely administrative sense. Mainstream historians point to the General Land Office surveys, the post-Civil War Reconstruction apparatus, and the explosive growth of the railroad network as the primary drivers. The railroads needed consistent station names. The federal government needed consistent tax records. The post office needed consistent routing. Put those three institutional pressures together and you get, the argument goes, a perfectly mundane explanation for a massive renaming event. And maybe that's all it is. I want to be honest about that possibility. But the official explanation has a problem. Several of them, actually. And the deeper you go into the municipal archives from this period, the less the tidy administrative story holds together. Let's start with the numbers, because the timeline isn't subtle. 1,213 renaming actions. That figure comes from cross-referencing the federal surveying records with state legislative archives and the early post office department routing tables, documents that are, remarkably, still partially accessible, sitting in filing cabinets at the National Archives in Washington and in the state historical societies of Ohio, Indiana, and Pennsylvania, though several key ledgers were reported missing as early as 1902. 1,213. In a country that, in 1871, had a federal bureaucracy that moved with the speed of a continental mail coach. Think about what that requires logistically. Each renaming had to be proposed, documented, cross-referenced with existing postal routes, approved at the federal level, communicated to state governments, filtered down to county courts, and then physically updated on every map, every deed, every official correspondence. In 1871. Without telegraphs reaching every county seat. Without typewriters in every clerk's office. Without a centralized federal geographic authority, that wouldn't legally exist until 1890, nearly 2 decades later. So who coordinated it? Speaking of coordination, there's a specific document that keeps appearing in the margins of this research, the Topographical Memoir, prepared by Army Corps of Engineers surveyors operating throughout the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys between 1867 and 1873. The memoir, portions of which were declassified in the 1970s and are held at the Library of Congress under Record Group 77, describes surveying teams encountering, and I'm quoting the phrasing here carefully, evidence of prior structural organization inconsistent with indigenous building traditions and predating known European settlement. The document uses the phrase prior structural organization 4 times across 11 pages. Then the language changes. In the 1874 follow-up survey of the same territories, the phrase disappears entirely. The sections referencing those findings are summarized in 3 sentences and deferred to a supplemental appendix that, according to the Library of Congress finding aid, was never filed. The timing is almost theatrical. Which brings me to what the renamed cities were actually named before 1871, and what they were renamed to, and why that distinction matters more than almost anyone has bothered to examine. There's a pattern in the pre-1871 names that mainstream historical linguistics tends to explain away as classical enthusiasm, the 18th and early 19th century fashion for naming American towns after ancient Mediterranean cities. Rome, New York. Athens, Georgia. Carthage, Missouri. Corinth, Mississippi. Alexandria, Virginia. Ithaca, New York. Troy, New York. Utica, New York. Syracuse, New York. The standard explanation is that educated founding-era Americans were steeped in classical literature, admired the Roman Republic as a template for democratic governance, and expressed that admiration through nomenclature. That explanation handles some of the cases comfortably. It handles them less comfortably when you map the density. In the state of New York alone, there are more place names derived from ancient Mediterranean cities than exist in all of modern Greece. We're not talking about 15 or 20 affectionate classical references. We're talking about a geographic saturation of classical nomenclature so dense, so specific, and so architecturally precise, not just city names, but county names, township names, river designations, that it begins to suggest something other than enthusiasm. It suggests inheritance. I don't have answers, only patterns. But this particular pattern keeps compounding. Here is what I spent 3 weeks trying to understand, and what no one fully explains: why the classical names clustered specifically in the regions with the most significant pre-colonial structural anomalies. The earthworks. Let's talk about the earthworks. The Ohio Valley contains what are, by any objective measurement, some of the most sophisticated geometric earthwork constructions in the Western Hemisphere. The Newark Earthworks in Licking County, Ohio, still partially visible today, a National Historic Landmark, originally covered 4 square miles of precisely calculated geometric forms, circles, octagons, and parallel walls aligned with lunar standstill cycles. The precision required to lay out a perfect circle 4 miles in circumference, on terrain with natural elevation variation, using only hand tools and naked-eye astronomy, is not trivial. Modern surveyors have measured the Newark octagon and found it accurate to within a fraction of a degree of true geometric regularity. That's not a casual construction project. The Hopewell tradition, the archaeological culture associated with these structures, flourished, according to accepted dating, between roughly 100 BCE and 500 CE. Their trade network stretched from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast. Their ceremonial sites suggest a level of organizational complexity that implies something much closer to urban administrative capacity than the word mound builders tends to communicate in popular history. And then they disappear from the archaeological record. Not gradually. Not through a slow cultural transition that historians can trace in artifact sequences and pottery styles over centuries. They disappear, and the archaeological consensus is remarkably uncomfortable with the specifics of that disappearance, defaulting to phrases like cultural transformation and population dispersal that describe the phenomenon without explaining the mechanism. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. But the earthwork sites cluster in the same river valleys where the 1871 renaming density was highest. And the Army Corps of Engineers surveys from 1867 to 1873 ran directly through the same territories. And the surveyors were finding something they described as prior structural organization inconsistent with indigenous building traditions. The pattern indicates something was being documented and then quietly filed away. Let me walk you through a specific case, because the abstract pattern becomes much harder to dismiss when you follow a single location through the archival record. Circleville, Ohio. Founded 1810. Named, according to the official account, for the circular earthwork enclosure that occupied the site when European settlers arrived. The earthwork, a perfect circle, approximately 1,150 feet in diameter, with a graded interior and precisely positioned gateway openings, was, by every contemporary description from the early 1800s, an extraordinary structure. Caleb Atwater, the postmaster and amateur archaeologist who surveyed it in 1820, described the gateway alignments as corresponding to the cardinal directions with an accuracy he found, in his words, not easily accounted for by any hypothesis of accidental formation. Circleville's original town plan was designed to follow the earthwork. The streets curved to match the circle. The central square occupied the geometric center of the ancient structure. Early maps of the town from the 1810s and 1820s show this clearly, a town literally built inside a pre-existing circular enclosure, with the enclosure's geometry determining the urban layout. By 1871, the earthwork was gone. Systematically demolished between 1837 and 1856 to allow for conventional rectangular street grid expansion. The circular street plan was gradually replaced. The town was, in the 1871 renaming process, reclassified in federal records with updated geographic coordinates that referenced only the new grid, not the original circular foundation. The archive of Atwater's original survey drawings was held at the Ohio Historical Society. 3 of the original 12 survey plates are currently listed as location unknown. That's not administrative housekeeping. That's a paper trail that stops. Speaking of paper trails that stop, there is the matter of the 1871 Incorporation Act itself. On April 20, 1871, Congress passed an act reorganizing the government of the District of Columbia. This legislation, technically a municipal governance reform, is cited by some researchers as the origin point of a sweeping change in how federal territorial jurisdiction was defined and recorded. The act created a new legal framework for what incorporated entities could hold in terms of territorial claim, record-keeping authority, and geographic naming rights. The connection to the 1,213 renaming events is not direct. It's circumstantial. But the circumstantiality has texture. In the 18 months following April 20, 1871, federal surveying activity in the Ohio and Mississippi valleys increased by a measurable factor. The Army Corps of Engineers deployment records for 1871 and 1872, held at the National Archives under Record Group 77, show surveying team deployments nearly double the rate of the preceding 5 years. The stated justification in the deployment orders is post-war infrastructure assessment. But the geographic distribution of those deployments doesn't map onto the obvious infrastructure priorities, the rail lines, the river ports, the growing industrial cities. The deployments cluster, instead, in rural territories with high concentrations of earthwork sites. What no one explains is why infrastructure assessment required that specific geographic focus. The part that keeps me up at night is simpler than any of the grand pattern. It's a small detail buried in the Post Office Department's 1873 annual report, a document available on microfilm at the Smithsonian Institution libraries. The report includes, almost as an afterthought on page 47, a reference to the completion of geographic regularization begun in the preceding session. That phrase, geographic regularization, appears nowhere in the 1871 or 1872 annual reports. It appears once, in 1873, as though referring to a program that had an official name inside the bureaucracy even though that official name never appeared in any public-facing legislation. Geographic regularization. 1,213 cities. In 2 years. Someone knew what they were doing. Someone had a name for it. Let me bring in a wider frame here, because what happened in 1871 America appears to rhyme with something that happened in other places, in other centuries, when new powers encountered evidence of older ones. When the Spanish arrived in Mesoamerica in the 16th century, one of their first systematic activities, beyond military conquest, was the renaming of every significant geographic feature. Mountains, rivers, cities, valleys. The renaming served a dual function. It disrupted the indigenous mnemonic geography that encoded historical and navigational knowledge in place names, and it asserted the new authority's primacy by overriding the landscape's existing narrative with a fresh one. Scholars of colonial cartography have written extensively about this process, how maps are never neutral, how the act of naming is always an act of claiming, and how the erasure of prior names is, functionally, an erasure of prior history. Maybe the American renaming of 1871 was nothing like that. Maybe the administrative pressures were exactly what the official record describes. Maybe the postal system genuinely needed that level of intervention, and the coincidence with the earthwork survey deployments is just coincidence, and the Army Corps language about prior structural organization was bureaucratic imprecision rather than deliberate vagueness. Maybe. But here's what matters. The people who conducted the geographic regularization of 1871 were not naive. They were, in many cases, extraordinarily well-educated men with formal training in history, engineering, and classical literature. They knew what the classical place names meant. They knew what the earthworks were. They had access to Atwater's surveys, to the earlier accounts of French missionaries who had described the earthwork cities in the 17th century, to the reports of Lewis and Clark, who had noted structural anomalies in the Missouri River territories that their journals described with careful neutrality. These were men who understood the weight of what they were looking at. And they renamed it anyway. The pattern sharpens when you look at what happened to the researchers who tried to document the pre-1871 landscape most thoroughly. Ephraim George Squire and Edwin Hamilton Davis published Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley in 1848, the first publication of the newly founded Smithsonian Institution. The book was, for its time, a remarkable work of empirical documentation. 306 earthwork sites surveyed, measured, and mapped across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, with scale drawings precise enough that modern archaeologists still reference them as primary sources for sites that no longer exist. Squire and Davis's central argument, stated carefully, but stated, was that the earthwork builders represented a civilization of significant organizational complexity, likely predating and culturally distinct from the indigenous peoples encountered by European settlers, and potentially connected to a broader continental or even transcontinental network of exchange and construction. The Smithsonian accepted the book, published it, then spent the next 40 years systematically walking back its implications. By the 1890s, the Bureau of American Ethnology, operating under the Smithsonian's institutional umbrella, had produced a counter-thesis. The mound builder civilization was not a separate advanced culture but simply the ancestors of contemporary Native American peoples, full stop, no mystery required. The thesis was presented as a correction of 19th-century racist mythology that had invented a lost white race to explain the earthworks. And that political dimension was real. There genuinely was a strain of racist pseudo-archaeology that needed correcting. But the correction overcorrected. In flattening the racist mythology, it also flattened the genuine empirical questions about organizational complexity, astronomical alignment precision, and the abruptness of the cultural disappearance. The baby went out with the bathwater. And the Smithsonian's institutional position, the position of the country's most powerful arbiter of archaeological legitimacy, shifted from "this requires investigation" to "this is settled." In 1897, 26 years after the geographic regularization. The timeline isn't subtle. Here is the question I keep returning to, the one that doesn't resolve cleanly regardless of which explanation you favor. If the 1871 renaming was purely administrative, if it was genuinely just postal chaos, railroad logistics, and Reconstruction-era federal consolidation, then the archival record of that process should be robust. Bureaucracies generate paperwork. Congressional acts generate debate transcripts, committee reports, correspondence between federal departments and state governments. For an operation affecting 1,213 named places across the country, you would expect to find a substantial institutional paper trail, the proposals, the rejections, the negotiations over which names stayed and which changed, the complaints from local communities who lost names they'd used for generations. That paper trail is thin. Remarkably thin for its scale. The procedural record that exists focuses on the post hoc standardization work, the Board of Geographic Names activity from the 1890s onward, rather than the primary renaming events of 1871 to 1873. The earlier documents, where they should exist in state and county archives, are notable for their scarcity. Some historians attribute this to the general archival chaos of the Reconstruction era, when federal record-keeping was genuinely inconsistent. That's a fair point. But the thinness isn't uniform. Records from the same period for other federal activities, railroad land grants, Homestead Act filings, military pension claims, are voluminous, detailed, and well-preserved. The geographic regularization records are, specifically and selectively, sparse. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. I want to be careful here. I'm not claiming a systematic destruction of records. I'm noting that the documentary footprint of a massive, nationally coordinated renaming event is disproportionately small, and that this disproportion sits uneasily alongside the Army Corps survey records that do survive and do describe findings that were never fully followed up in the public record. Something happened in 1871. Something large enough to require a name inside the federal bureaucracy. Something connected to earthwork territories in the Ohio and Mississippi valleys. Something that reorganized the geographic vocabulary of the entire country in under 2 years. And the people who did it left almost no explanation for why. What survives, if you know where to look, is the landscape itself. Partially. The Newark earthworks still exist, the golf course built on top of them in 1910 is a whole separate conversation, and modern LiDAR surveys of the Ohio Valley have revealed, in the last decade, the faint subsurface signatures of earthwork structures that were demolished in the 19th century and are no longer visible to the naked eye. The technology is allowing archaeologists to reconstruct, digitally, a network of geometric enclosures that was far more extensive than even Squire and Davis documented. The LiDAR data, compiled largely by researchers at the University of Cincinnati and available through the Ohio LiDAR Consortium, shows something the 19th century surveyors couldn't fully appreciate: the earthwork sites weren't isolated. They were connected. Road traces, shallow linear depressions that the LiDAR algorithms flag as potentially engineered rather than natural, run between major earthwork complexes at intervals that suggest planned connectivity rather than coincidence. The researchers are careful with their language. They say, potentially engineered. They say, consistent with, rather than, proof of. They're being appropriately scientific. But the shapes are there, in the ground, waiting. And some of them run directly beneath cities that were renamed in 1871. I don't know what that means. I genuinely don't. Maybe it means nothing. Maybe the road traces are natural drainage features that the LiDAR algorithm is misreading. Maybe the overlap with renamed cities is statistical noise in a dataset large enough to produce apparent correlations by chance. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. But I've looked at the LiDAR maps. I've looked at the pre-1871 place name distributions. I've read the Army Corps survey language. I've traced the Smithsonian's institutional pivot. I've counted the missing archival pages and the unfiled appendices and the post hoc standardization that came 19 years after the renaming it was supposedly designed to formalize. And I keep arriving at the same uncomfortable place. The part that keeps me up at night isn't the grand theory. It's the human dimension of what was lost. Somewhere in the Ohio Valley, in a year before 1871, someone lived in a town with a name that meant something specific in the local memory, a name that referenced a physical feature, or a historical event, or a structural inheritance from an older landscape. That name was changed. The person who lived there didn't get a vote. Their county clerk received a federal directive. The new name went into the postal records. The old name faded from official use within a generation, survived maybe in family letters and local oral tradition, and then disappeared entirely when those families moved and those traditions dissolved in the general churn of 19th-century American mobility. Multiply that by 1,213. The official narrative says this was rationalization. Progress. The necessary pain of building a coherent national identity from a chaotic collection of regional settlements. Maybe it was. Maybe that's exactly and only what it was. But progress always has a direction. And the direction of this particular progress, from named to renamed, from documented to regularized, from the language of prior organization to the language of fresh settlement, ran consistently in one direction. Away from the evidence of something older. The archive of Caleb Atwater's missing survey plates has never been located. The supplemental appendix from the 1874 Army Corps memoir was never filed. The procedural record of 1,213 renamings is thinner than the paperwork generated by a single railroad land grant dispute. And somewhere beneath a golf course in Licking County, Ohio, a perfect octagon aligned to the major lunar standstill sits in the ground, waiting for someone to ask why it was built, who built it, and why the generation that found it spent so much energy making sure we'd have trouble asking those questions. I don't have answers. I have 1,213 data points, a missing appendix, and a pattern that the evidence keeps returning to whether I want it to or not. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it.